What's up, witches? Welcome to another episode of the BetterWitch podcast presented by the Modern Witch Network. I'm your host, Allie, aka BronxWitch. I'm a tarot reader, Reiki healer, and the owner of BronxWitch HeadQuarters, a conjure shop and witchy workshare space in the Bronx, New York. And I'm going to be coming to you every week with a new topic and perhaps a guest co-host to share our real life experiences and some of the things that we've learned along the way as practicing witches. Because when we know better, we witch better. Today's guest co-host is Thorn Mooney. Thorn is a Gardnerian priestess operating in Raleigh, North Carolina. She's also the author of Traditional Wicca, A Seeker's Guide, and The Witch's Path, Advancing Your Craft at Every Level. And Thorn's been blogging, sharing videos, and creating magical content online for more than a decade. So we've got our teas, we've got our coffees, we're good to go. So I'll get started so I'm not taking up too much of your day. But we'll just get into the conversation about Coven life. And I think what will probably be most helpful to our listeners and our watchers, we are video casting on YouTube, would be to talk a little bit about your experience with covens, because it started pretty early in life, and I imagine you've grown quite a bit since you first started pursuing coven life. And I know that you started as a teenager, right?
Pursuing, yeah. I think that I had kind of a fantasy as a young witch. I came in at the tail end of the 90s and then into the early 2000s, and there was a lot in the media, I think, at the time about groups. Like, even on the cover of Silver Ravenwolf's Teen Witch, it's not like one girl in her room doing a thing. It's a whole group of young witches. And I had this fantasy initially about just being with people who were like me, because I was really isolated. It was something that I was keeping secret from my parents, and I didn't know anybody else at my school. I went to a really small school, which didn't help, who was into the same sort of stuff, and I always felt like a weirdo. So I had this fantasy initially of just having friends, and I think that's where the desire for a coven, for a lot of people, where that's rooted, is just relationships and friendship. The desire for something like training happened really later.
I love that you just mentioned that, because that's one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about, because I was listening to you kind of touch on this issue in some of your YouTube videos and kind of addressing the issue of whether or not a coven is a place where you're supposed to get education and training. Like, is that even, when we say the word coven, what do we even mean by that? So we kind of know what to expect when we're trying to find a group for us. Is it friendship? Is it just a group of people who are kind of doing similar things? Or is it supposed to be a place that has kind of more of a hierarchy, where there are elders or experienced witches who have taken on the responsibility of teaching the next generation? I have always thought of it as the latter, but I'm starting to realize that that's not necessarily the case, because I've always been a solitary. So I've always thought to myself, like, oh, a coven, that is where you go if you want to be guided down a certain path. And to some extent, maybe that's part of why I haven't felt like a coven is right for me. But if someone is thinking about coven life, I guess kind of what you're saying in your experience is it's been also a place to find friendship, not so much education. So coven life can be really just about finding community and not necessarily being like led to a certain path. Is that?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's such a messy term, and I think one of the disservices
Language is so tricky anyway.
One of the disservices that we do each other is by using that word and potentially lots of other words as though they have really simple meanings, when the reality is that we're all using that term to mean something different. So the answer to all of that is like, yes, a coven is those things. So there are, and some of that will vary by tradition, but some of it also just varies by the personalities involved and the goals of the people involved. There are groups out there that very much are about a particular kind of training, a tradition. So like I'm a Gardnerian, for example, and if you join a Gardnerian coven, this is generally true, what you are seeking is to learn how to practice in a Gardnerian framework, which presumably you don't already know. So you need somebody who is knowledgeable to show you how it's done, usually over a period of time, kind of to put it really simply. And that process usually involves hierarchy, it involves an initiatory process, etc. And in some traditions, there are kind of rules in place as far as like how much socializing happens. Because some groups find that socializing can be detrimental. Some groups find it very beneficial. Sometimes you have to have been with a group for a certain period of time, or sometimes it's viewed very strictly as like, no, this is a magical esoteric order. It's not about having friends. It's about learning something. You get in, you get out. You know, you're here to work.
Right.
So like that's definitely a perspective that exists that I have personally participated in. But I think that probably most of the time, at least nowadays online, when folks use the word coven, I mean, you hear people use that word to refer to like their Patreon members or their Discord members, their followers on TikTok, like my coven. Hi, coven. What's up, coven? And I'm not going to roll out and tell them that like they don't get to use that word. So yeah, I think there are other traditions, and there are people who aren't in traditions at all, folks who would identify as eclectic, who come together, and the covens that they form are maybe more like family groups, or they're rooted in friendship. It is about that tight-knit group of, you know, like girlfriends maybe who they're modeling something that maybe they saw in Practical Magic. Like the ending of Practical Magic is a really good example of that, where like all the women in the neighborhood get together and they don't even have to identify as witches, but they're working magic together, and that becomes a coven.
Right.
And I think those definitions are just as valid. So the seeker has to ask themselves, what is it that you want?
And that's kind of refreshing to hear that there are these different versions. It might make it a little bit tricky in terms of conversation, you know, where you have to sort of establish like, well, what are you talking about when you say coven? And what are you talking about when you say coven? And like, let's get on the same page as we have this conversation. But once you know that you're on the same page, it's kind of nice to know that there are these different versions of coven out there. And so if you feel called to have community, whether it's for education, to be initiated into a certain tradition, or it is just to be a part of a family or a social group, that there's something out there for you. And it may require a little bit of looking and searching and stuff like that, but there is probably a coven that fits into the mold of what you need in terms of support as a witch. So I think my takeaway from that is not to be too, and this is like advice to myself, not to be too rooted in one idea of what a coven is, totally. or can be. And then along the lines of like what you do to get into a coven, I really appreciate the information that you shared in the way you set up your book, Traditional Wicca. In a lot of books on Wicca that I am familiar with, if any talk is given at all to coven life, because like such an emphasis is put on solitary eclectic practice, and so if there is anything talked about in terms of coven, it's usually just like a short little chapter at the back of the book that's like, you know, find a group, maybe some like outdated links and things like that of like where you can look. And so yeah, some old publications that are, you know, no longer, I forget what book I was looking through that was like, attend events at Magical Child. Oh my gosh. And I was like, oh, wow, you know, Things have changed. So
Would you like
those,
a hilarious tangent real quick? So
yes.
I had one of those books like as a teenager that was like Magical Child, New York
Yeah.
City. And
Yeah.
I went to New York as like a 16 or 17-year-old with my mother. It was like a birthday trip. I went to go
Uh-huh.
see like Les Mis on Broadway. It was very
Nice.
cool. First time I'd ever been like on a trip like that. And friends, I had that book with like the old address for Magical Child, and I hunted the streets looking
Yeah.
for this, and I didn't tell my mom what I was looking for. I was
Yeah.
like, well, let's go down this alley. Magical Child had not been there in decades. But like I didn't have the internet to tell me that.
Right, right. Yeah, it's so it's I'm going to get to this in a second cuz I want to talk about Witchbox, but I used to use our dear departed Witchbox,
No.
and information was often outdated and not up to date. So I cannot tell you the dead ends that I came to looking for coven information, things like that back in the day. But I really appreciate in your book that you dedicate so much time to talking about the coven experience and coven life, and really going far more into depth than I had seen previously on like what to expect and what to do if you really are interested in being in a coven. And I actually have a passage that I highlighted that I would like to read for the listeners, okay? I tossed back my drink like an action hero before he jumps off a cliff. Because this ad wasn't here the last time I was seeking. Last time, I'd emailed covens in Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. Last time, I'd driven 4 hours one way to circle with people who, though they were dear to me, knew plain well that I didn't belong. I'd just gotten out of a bad relationship. I just applied to graduate school. I just picked up and moved to a new city. I was ready to start my life over. This ad was here for me. I knew it. Now I just needed to get them to let me in. I really love that passage because it shows to me the tenacity that is required if you are interested in coven life. And we are still not at a point where, and probably this is for the better, but we are not at a point where you can kind of just like, walk into your local Starbucks and join a coven. You do still at this point need to perhaps travel long distances, send multiple requests to speak with someone, have face-to-face meetings, to become invited into a group like that. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like, actually putting in legwork to become a part of a coven, and how it felt finding a coven and then realizing that they weren't the right ones, and what was the journey like to finding the right coven home for you?
There's a lot of feelings wrapped up in that. And there's lots of, I feel like I should preface this by saying that I wish it wasn't like that. Because we have to think about things like, like ableism and having expendable income. And there's all kinds of stuff that ends up sort of inadvertently going into seeking that I think most of us wish wasn't the case. Like I had to be able to afford like a car and to take care of the car so I could drive 4 hours, and then having time in my work schedule. And
Right.
like that by itself brings up a lot of feelings for me as a coven leader, because I wish it wasn't like that. But yeah, it's kind of like, I think about, I've made a couple of analogies in the past. One is to dating, right? Like finding a coven isn't dating, but I feel like a lot of the same kinds of nonsense.
Similar. I feel like
Yeah.
it's similar. You're trying to get to know somebody. It's kind of intimate. You have to let them know personal information kind of upfront before you even know
Yeah.
like if it's going to work out. So
And
it's
it
a
can be,
vulnerable process.
yeah, and you can invest a whole lot of time in somebody, and then they can really break your heart or disappoint you, or you find out something that that's a deal breaker. And we can be with people for years and then decide we actually need something else, or they decide they need something else. And covens, I mean, people go to great lengths to find dates, right? Dating websites and traveling and reality shows. And
Yeah, it's big business.
and I think it's more like that than a lot of other things I could think about. where you're always dealing with people's emotions. So if I send an email to a group leader and they're having a bad day, or they're having a bad week, or they're on vacation and then my email gets lost or something, that's just like kind of the human condition. Which is why I tell people you don't want to like harass somebody, okay?
Yeah.
But it's not bad form to follow up, just because you're interacting with people. Um, and yeah, like if you have, again, like dating, like I live in, if I live in a tiny town in North Carolina, which I have done before, and I'm looking to like get married to somebody real liberal who went to an Ivy League, or I have like all of these checklist items.
Mm-hmm.
I might need to leave my tiny town in North Carolina to find them. I
To
might need
find
to go,
that.
yeah, I might need to go to New England, or I might need to go to California. And with covens, it's kind of the same way. Like if you have a vision of something specific that you want, which I encourage people to have, it might not be where you are. And then the question is, how much do you want it? And is it something that you can prioritize? Is it something that you can rearrange your life to get? And sometimes it's not worth it. Um,
If someone is thinking about making that type of a commitment and taking that type of a leap, I'm going to drive 6 hours to this coven, I'm going to move to this area. What would you say is, maybe top priority in terms of what they can do to educate themselves about that group before they take that jump? What might be the one or two things that you would say someone needs to know before they say, yeah, I'm going to pack up all my stuff and move across town, or drive to another state, or, agree to stay overnight with coven members that maybe I haven't met in person before? Like,
Sure.
what might I want to know before I do something like that?
Well, it's 2022, so my first advice is to internet stalk the shit out of them.
Okay. Yeah. Background check websites, all that stuff. Yeah.
My experience overwhelmingly has been that the average person is lovely and has good intentions. And a lot of the times, the people who do wrong to us or who harm us don't do so intentionally. Like, that's kind of the place where I live most of the time. But given that, like, stuff happens. So I would say it is A-okay to have really long, drawn out conversations and interactions online or in casual settings. If somebody is inviting you to their house, like after one email, that to me is a red flag. My coven, everybody who has ended up joining my group has interacted with us socially and casually for an extended period. And it's not so much because we're super suspicious of newcomers as it is, it's like dating. Like it's okay to have like the extended conversations, to feel each other out. Now we have things like Zoom. We didn't have that when I was first seeking. And you can get a lot off of somebody just interacting with them like you and I are interacting right now. Do all of that stuff. And if a coven tells you that like that's not acceptable for some reason, like that to me is a big red flag. They should also be really open to your questioning. I try to be absolutely as frank as possible with people. I mean, even if we're talking about a group that is like oath-bound or secretive, or they have like, secret stuff over here that they're not going to tell you, that stuff is never about things like safety, right?
Okay.
It's always like, yeah, I've got like a secret liturgy over here. I'm not going to show you this particular ritual, but I will 100% tell you, like, if it means that like you have to be naked, or you have like that kind of stuff is not secret.
Yeah. So
And
like
it's okay
secret rituals, rituals that we don't share with the public, that we only do behind closed doors, is one thing, but like where you're going to be staying for the night
exactly
should not be a secret kind of thing. If you're physically relocating or staying with the coven members.
Yeah, like
that kind of.
The names and addresses of the coven members is private, but like how many there are going to be there, or like details about some of those people, or like I knew when I was approaching the coven that I ended up initiating into in the Gardnerian tradition, like I didn't know the intimate details of everybody's lives, but I knew like how many people would be at the meeting I was going to, and I had a sense of like who they were, like a little bit about their backgrounds. And it's just a way of putting people at ease. Like you don't have to hand out like people's private phone numbers to do that. Right. Like I could tell you, oh, there's going to be 5 of us, you know, I'll be there with my working partner. Like he's been working with me in the coven for X number of years. We've also got another first degree who's going to come. You know what I mean? Like that kind of stuff is not secret.
Yeah.
And it's okay to ask, where am I going to be? How long am I going to be there? Like what's entailed? Do I need to bring anything? To ask about like food or like accommodations, like all of that stuff. If you get to that point where you're thinking about going somewhere, I always tell people too, we've for the most part, we've dealt with people who are like in the state. We've only had a couple of instances where people have really come from far away. But I also tell people at a first meeting, bring a best friend, bring a spouse, bring whatever. If somebody tells you that you have to go by yourself, that to me is a red flag.
Yeah.
I know that has happened in the past. Like I hear stories, you can read those sort of like sensationalist occult memoirs from like the 70s and 80s where it's like, I was taken by myself to a dark room and I didn't know what was going to happen.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, that should not be happening. We've learned a lot since those days. Yeah.
And it sets people at ease. So as a high priestess, I tell people, like, bring a friend. Like, it's totally cool. You know, we always meet in a public place. Like, it doesn't have to, if it feels dangerous, that's a problem.
Right. And most covens, or maybe I shouldn't say most, I don't know, but it seems like at least the covens I'm familiar with have events or things that they do that are kind of more generally open to the public. And then there are usually levels of commitment, essentially, right? So you can sort of start as a dedicant or someone who's interested, and then can move towards that step of initiating. And I would say that's probably another one of those like red flag things. If you just meet a coven and they're like, you must initiate into this group before you can do anything further, that's probably not. I think most legit kind of covens want you to kind of more casually interact with them first. Is that like a fair assessment?
That's been my experience too, and that's definitely how we operate. It even says on our little website, like, this is the bar where the high priestess likes to hang out. like come chill.
Get to know us.
Yeah, like I, as a group leader, and this is something that you'll see too, group leaders or other people in covens often also have a relationship with a public community somewhere. So for example, like I live in North Carolina, there's a group in my area called TAPA, which is the Triangle Area Pagan Alliance. And it's a network of groups, and there's like socials and meet and greets. And it's a way to meet a whole bunch of people without a commitment. And if you come and you hang out like at those events over the course of like, you know, a few months, a year or two, like you will get a pretty good sense of a group leader. You'll know if they creep you out.
Yeah.
And I think it's good. This is me like being a little bit like judgmental here. I think it is good practice as a group leader to have a relationship with an open community. I think that's just good form. I think it's a way of creating safe and accommodating spaces for seekers, especially as like we live in a dangerous world, you know, and that's just true. And I want to encourage seekers and folks who are curious about groups to explore. You know, I think sometimes people don't want to get involved in covens because it's nerve-wracking to be around any sort of people. And anything that we can do to like make that experience like better, I think is our obligation as group leaders. I think it's a good time for a break.
And I think that in a lot of ways, that brings a certain sense of safety to the coven too, in the community, for the community at large to have a general idea of what you're doing. Because I think, we obviously live in a world where there's still a lot of stigma and mystery around witches and what are they doing, and is this demonic or is this evil, and having a relationship with the public as a coven, I think also helps to put people's mind at ease. Not that that's like the coven's responsibility, but I do think that it makes it safer for the coven to be in existence if people kind of understand what's happening there, and it's not, what's going on in those meetings, and like, no, you can't go to that event. Like, no, come, we're doing the same things you would do at an event, or, things like that. So, probably one of the big questions that new witches have is where can I find groups like this? And so that brings me back to our dear Witch Vox and things like that. So if you're listening or you're watching and you're new on your journey, or you're younger, that you might not be familiar with the thing that predated witch talk and all of these things, there was a resource website called witchvox, VOX.org, I think it was.
It was .com.
Was it .com? Oh, that's kind
of
fancy.
Long time ago.
Yeah.
I can still remember.
Yeah. So WitchVox, and it was the witch's voice, and it was a website that aimed to unite witches across the country and make it possible for you to search for shops and groups and events by location. So if you were moving somewhere or you lived somewhere and you needed to find folks, you could. And it was never the best. It was never like the most high-tech situation. So there were often, outdated links, and groups would move and not change information and stuff like that. But for the most part, it really was a good resource, and it was something that that we had, and that is no more, right? That ended a couple years ago now.
Yeah, maybe like 3 years ago. Well, and it was volunteer run.
Yeah.
Like this was a labor of love by a very small group of folks. And like, it was just this amazing, beautiful example of what practitioners can accomplish when they come together with kind of a common goal. And you would, like, anytime you were rolling through a new area, you'd get on WitchVox and you'd look and see, like, is there a shop nearby? Are there events going on? And it was always really exciting, like emailing a WitchVox listing and then hoping it was still active.
Yeah, you're like, oh my God, someone answered. They're like, yes, come to our shop. It was a very useful resource and a very special thing, and a very much a forward-thinking thing, because it existed before we were in this space of like, oh, just Google it, or like, oh, there's a directory for that, or oh, there's a thing for that. And it would be really cool to see that be like revived in today's world with all of the different apps and programs and integrations and things that are available for folks. But we do have other resources, and we still have the internet. Obviously, we just don't have that site. So people are now in different places. I think Facebook's probably a big place where people create groups or pages to pull people together across geographic boundaries, or to let folks know that they're there. But if you were searching for Coven events or full-on membership at this point, where might you start in a World Sans WitchVox?
Well, there's a few things. So there have been a few attempts to kind of replicate the Witchbox experience. So there are websites out there that do that. There's one in particular who I'm sure I'm going to mangle. I think it's called Mandragora Magica, which was started a couple of years ago, relatively recently, and it tends, from what I can see, and I think it's because, if I'm correct, it was founded by some traditional Wiccans. It tends to focus on that style, but anybody can submit a listing. So if you visit them, you will see some things. I know that there are lots of groups on Facebook that are geared towards helping people find groups. I'm not a Facebook user myself, so I can't personally vouch for that sort of thing. But I know that that's a big way now that people find groups. What I would do personally.
Yeah.
What I would do personally.
That's what we're here for, Thorn.
Yeah.
We're trying to be better witches. How would you do this?
What would I do?
Yes. What would you do?
I would get on social media and I would stalk hashtags. And I would try to find users in my area, and then I would stalk them. And I would figure out if they were in groups or if there were events going on, because people will post about it. People will post about all kinds of personal stuff.
Right.
And it might take several months. And if you're feeling brave, you can also just DM people. Let's be real. The reason we're all on social media is because we do want to interact with people.
Yeah.
And there are some big accounts where it gets hard to wade through a lot of DMs. But a lot of smaller accounts, it's really easy to just shoot a message, and it could just be hey, I think we're in the same state. Do you know if there are any groups in the area? I'm really interested in this thing. And if you hear back, cool. And if you don't, cool. So before I was on TikTok, I was using hashtag witches of Instagram. That seemed to be the big one.
I use that one sometimes.
Yeah, you can also if there's a particular tradition you're interested in, a lot of the times there are hashtags associated with that tradition. May not be a ton of posts, but it might give you somewhere to start. But I get online and I kind of cast a net on social media, and then I bully people into giving me information. That's kind of what I do. A lot of people also, I know it's websites aren't as much of a thing anymore, but a lot of the covens that I know still have some kind of little website. I know my group does. And maybe you get on Google and if you want to be Blue Star or you want to be Alexandrian, you type in Alexandrian Wicca, Vermont or whatever state you're in, and see what churns up.
Yeah. I like the idea of the hashtags. I think that's really helpful, because I usually use them to kind of categorize the things that I post, but they are really useful as a search tool as well. And I would start with, witches of blank, your state or your city, and see who else is using that hashtag.
Oh yeah.
That could really help, because I post things, and I post, hashtag witches of the Bronx, witches of New York.
Yeah.
I should probably search those hashtags.
Yeah. If you,
I literally never thought of that.
Yeah, hashtags are a funny thing. So one thing that every now and then I will get, somebody will this happens very rarely, but every now and then somebody will message me and they'll go, hey, I noticed that you tagged this post hashtag green witch, but you're not a green witch. Why are you using this hashtag? It's because the thing I posted might be interesting to those people.
Right.
I think we tend to think of hashtags as only having one function, oh, this is me categorizing a post. But hashtags are communities. Hashtags are search, what is the word I want? They're search criteria.
They're a search category, so right.
When I use the hashtag traditional witch, that doesn't mean that I'm doing Robert Cochran over here. It means that whatever it is that I've posted, I think would be interesting to these folks. Or I want myself or my post or whatever to come up in searches when people who define themselves this way are looking for something.
Right.
Like, hashtags are really powerful tools.
That can be really, really helpful. And
Mhm.
then everybody is on the tickety talkities. I
Yeah.
am not. Oh, speaking of TikTok, this is sort of a side note that doesn't
Yeah.
have. Well, oh no, it does have to do with Covens actually. Okay, so you posted on your Instagrams. I'm on Instagram, so I can only see people's TikToks when they do the repost thing.
Yeah.
So I saw that you reposted some TikToks to your Instagram, and the stories about being young and being Wiccan set to auto tune
Oh my God.
are hilarious. They are hilarious. I don't know if you're doing more on TikTok and you only post a few to Instagram, but I need more. The Instagram people, we need more. Those
Well,
are
and
so freaking funny.
that was a TikTok trend. So like TikTok is kind of funny, and I think this is one of the reasons why it's hard to understand sometimes, is like it's a combination of things where like there might be like good kind of staid information where somebody's just talking at you, like maybe they'll have like some soft music in the background, but then there's also like silly dances and people doing goofy things, or like
that's all I know about TikTok,
like
is just like dance
thinking
stuff.
something.
Yeah.
And those things are trends, and it's kind of funny, like thinking about like magical thinking, where we sort of give all of this power to an algorithm, and like we don't say certain words because YouTube will filter it out, and then I'll be suppressed in the algorithm, and like nobody has any really like hard and fast evidence for these things happening. We just all kind of believe that they're true.
Right.
So
oh, that's like shadow banning. I've always just been like, how do you know? But I just believe you.
Yes. Like, so on TikTok, people participate in trends because the belief that seems to be true is that the more trends you participate in, the more your serious videos will circulate.
Oh, okay.
So like, I'm going to do a stupid dance to a stupid song.
Right.
And it's going to trick you into like coming to my...
clickbait. I'm going to suck you into my world, and then I'm going to talk about religious theory.
Right. And so like for me, I don't know where the actual like the trend of the autotune thing started. There are some big creators on YouTube who have definitely on TikTok, excuse me, who've popularized it. And to me, I thought it was just the funniest thing.
It's hilarious.
It's really funny. And I have a lot of really stupid like adolescent stories like that.
I think they're so funny, and I think the auto-tune just makes it perfect, because for some reason I imagine that you're like T-Pain in a nightclub, but for some reason you're telling this story about like your pentagrams, and like I thought they were so funny. But since you are on the TikTok and have some exposure on this platform, is TikTok a place that people can find covens or join covens, or is TikTok not?
I think that TikTok
serious
is
enough.
TikTok is tricky because I think that there's informative stuff out there, and there are really serious practitioners out there who I think are saying really interesting things, and who definitely deserve to be listened to. I don't think that TikTok is this garbage pile of nonsense that like other people describe it as on other platforms. That has not been my experience. But that said, there's like billions and billions of people using TikTok. There's just objectively more content on TikTok than there is on Instagram, as far as I can tell anyway, which means that there's more nonsense to wade through. And I don't think TikTok's hashtags are quite as refined as Instagram are, because we're sort of like praying to the algorithm gods. Like I know what TikTok hashtags I'm supposed to use and what trends I'm supposed to do theoretically to be boosted. And if I use a hashtag that only has, thousands of uses instead of billions of uses, I'm less inclined to use it, which makes TikTok much harder to navigate.
Yeah.
But that algorithm does seem to be really sensitive. And if you interact with that high quality content, my experience has been that that's what you will tend to see on your For You page. So like I never saw any of the stuff that was like, hex the moon, hex the like I still have no idea what people are talking about when they talk about TikTok dramas, because I don't interact with those accounts.
Okay.
So I would say like get on TikTok and keep an ear out. And if you're searching for Coven, like if that is your your MO is to find groups, then I would keep that in mind as I'm using the app.
And
And
maybe try to refine what you look
yeah,
for and what you are, what hashtags you use or things like
yeah.
that to kind of.
Keeping in mind kind of what we were talking about earlier, where people use the word coven really broadly. So like TikTok is one of the places more than anywhere else where I've found coven used to mean really different things. So like a lot of people refer to their Discord as a coven. And that might not be what you mean when you're
Right,
looking
right,
for a group.
right.
Um, but yeah, like it's a long, messy process. Um, so I don't know.
Yeah.
Um,
But you are in a coven, you are a coven
mhm.
leader. And so I guess you would say that the search is worth it. What are
Yeah.
some of the personal benefits that you have received as a witch, as a coven member? Being taken under folks' wings or having community, what have been some of the benefits to that for you?
There've been several. I think the biggest thing offhand that kind of comes immediately is just that feeling of being in a group and shedding that kind of isolation that I think a lot of witches experience, especially new witches.
Yeah.
Um, there's really nothing that compares to like celebrating with a bunch of other people who don't think you're crazy and don't think that you're satanic or don't think that
Yeah.
you're, unless you are satanic, because those witches
Right.
are out there too, like
And
more
that's
power to
fine.
you. but
Yeah. Yeah,
but
that's
like
fine.
who aren't like gonna give you lectures about your lifestyle choices,
Yeah.
like that experience of being in community with like-minded people really is such a balm on so many of the hurts that I think people struggle with. And you don't have to be in a coven to have those experiences, okay? But that was something that I really experienced for the first time in a coven situation. Um, Having people to push against my ideas was the next thing. I think people have this, there's kind of this stereotype about covens, especially covens that are in a particular tradition, where like, well, I'd never be in a coven because I don't want to be told what to do and blah blah blah. Like we're all just engaging in group think, and that hasn't been my experience at all.
Okay.
Like even in even when in a situation where there's a hierarchy, like my high priestess was never the boss of my life. Like she didn't tell me what to think. Like she was there and worth listening to in my eyes because she had more experience, especially in the tradition that I wanted to be a part of. She had decades of life experience that I did not and could talk about people and places and things that I just objectively had never experienced. And that was valuable. Um, but I can bring ideas, whether it's like, hey, I read this book, or hey, I wrote this ritual. What do you think? I can bring that to my working partner who runs my group with me, and he can go, I don't think so, Thorn. Like, slow your roll, right? Or he can
Okay.
go, okay, but maybe try this instead. Or yeah, I think that's a cool idea. What would you think about this? Like when group work is good, it's really good. When it's bad, it can be really bad, just like any sort of group.
Right.
But those were the big things, was people to challenge me and to encourage me, people to share different ideas and perspectives, and then not being the only one responsible for making the magic happen. Um, yeah,
And
like,
speaking of the magic, do
mhm.
you feel like your magical practice improved being in a coven? Like, did you learn? I know we were saying that covens are not necessarily a place where you are going to get instruction. It
Mhm.
may be, it may not be. But for you personally, do you feel like your magic was informed by your coven members, or are they kind of separate parts of your life? You've got your own magical practice, and then gatherings with the coven, and they don't inform each other.
Well, yes to both of those things. So one of the things that's cool about Foxfire is that our members have different magical backgrounds too. Some of us were teen Wiccans, Others are coming from ceremonial backgrounds or were atheists entirely before they came to us, or they have experiences in other traditions of witchcraft. And it's cool being in a situation where maybe we have a magical goal collectively, and somebody in the group can go, "Oh yeah, this totally reminds me of this thing from like the Greek magical papyri and blah 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 blah." Or I took this thing with, Jason Miller's sorcery class last year. Like whatever it is, we can have conversations about different magical systems that individually, like maybe we wouldn't have been exposed to. And that can make magic much stronger. There's also this kind of occult idea that the more hands you have on deck, the more powerful the working can be. So that plays a factor too. I'll say that isn't true for like all types of magic across the board. It's often true for like Wiccan styles of magic, but it can vary. But at the same time, I have a magical practice that is separate from the Coven in the sense that I have workings that are more appropriate to do by myself, or it's something like I'm also a Minerval in the OTO, so I'm involved in philemic communities.
Okay.
And I have other, religious interests or magical interests. So the cool thing to me is that as a new practitioner, we put so much pressure on people to pick. Are you going to be a solitary or in a coven? And the reality is that most of us are both of those things at some point, or I was very coven oriented in my 20s. I tend to do things more by myself as I approach my 40s. Like your life will look different, and that's awesome.
Right. Yeah. What I was about to ask is in terms of like what people can expect. Once you've done the work of finding a group that you feel comfortable with and the red flags are not present or you've addressed any ones that were there, and you feel like they're right for you, what can someone expect when they get into a coven? Obviously, they're very different, but let's say someone is exploring a Wiccan coven that, sort of tends to follow an expected model. What's the trajectory? How long of a process is it usually before you're an actual initiated member?
Sure. That can really vary, and even within the same tradition. So, for example, in Gardnerian Wicca, in the United States versus in Britain, there are often a lot of differences. So, like one of the differences is that in the United States, you'll probably run into something called an outer court. Yeah. Sometimes they're called groves or pagan circles or just circles, where these are folks who aren't initiates. Maybe they're some kind of dedicant, or they're still called seekers or students. People will use different terms. And those exist as a way for people to explore, do ritual with group members before they undertake initiation or some other kind of obligation. This exists in other esoteric orders too. Where here's kind of a neutral space where you're still engaged in magical interaction with a coven, but you haven't signed a bloody oath or something.
Right.
As all covens make
Not
you
yet.
do eventually.
Yeah, exactly. Not yet.
So it's normal to expect there to be some kind of guesting period where you get to see some kind of ritual and experience some kind of ritual without being obligated. My understanding is that in the UK, you don't tend to see outer courts, but there's still going to be some kind of vetting process. Maybe you'll get to know people socially. You'll interact with them in other kinds of situations, but it won't be something so formal as an outer court. It's very normal to have to ask to be initiated. This will vary, but usually it's not just something that's handed out. Usually you have to demonstrate, some kind of commitment on your own. You have to actually go hey, I want to be initiated. What do I need to do? Okay. So people shouldn't expect to just be offered things.
Right. There should be no coven leaders in your DMs.
There should be no coven leaders in your DMs. Wicca in particular has a very strong taboo against what's called proselytizing, where we seek members, and that would be considered proselytizing. It's normal for it to take a long time. I think nowadays, a lot of people have heard the phrase a year and a day. That's not really a formal thing in Wicca as a whole. And lots of other groups use the model of a year and a day. It's got kind of an interesting history involving like legal persecution, and like it's kind of a funny phrase, but it's still kind of a good marker. Like it could potentially take a while. I've worked with people who have been initiated in a matter of months. I've worked with people maybe because they've done previous kinds of work, or they knew the Coven members in some other fashion more intimately. And I've had people in Foxfire who have stayed in outer court for 2 years, 3 years. So it really is very individual. But the Coven will be upfront with you about that stuff. And it's always fair to ask those kinds of questions. What's the timeline I can expect? What are the expectations? Like, that's your right as a seeker to ask those things.
Okay. And if you are in that seeking phase or dedicant phase, and you're in the outer court, or maybe you're not even quite there yet, maybe you're just attending events that are being thrown or something like that, where's the point where you start being given responsibilities? Because I feel like sometimes when I hear folks tell their like not so great stories or not so great experiences, a lot of it has to do with being given responsibilities, whether they're financial responsibilities or planning responsibilities, like way early on. And it's kind of obvious that the Coven is maybe not as established as it's suggested, or that it's in desperate need of folks, which is kind of, I guess, it's not like no judgment. Like if your Coven's kind of struggling to find membership, then that's not necessarily like something to be criticized for. But shouldering folks who are just kind of loosely coming in with responsibilities and things like that, I hear about that happening to folks. So like, when would it be appropriate for someone to say, okay, you're now responsible for doing this thing for the group?
Yeah, so I think kind of to address that really broadly, because I hear that too. And I definitely think that there is sort of like, there's this concern of being taken advantage of as a newcomer. One of the remedies to that is to be really clear when you're going in what sort of Coven it is. So for example, like if you are told this is a traditional Gardnerian Coven, like these are our leaders, this is how the structure works. In a group like that, you would not be expected to be doing things like writing rituals, right? Or supplying the ritual tools.
Yeah, like bringing the tools. Or
that would be weird. But if you are working with somebody or interested in somebody who is just setting up a group, like what you were saying, and maybe they're still building their membership, to that group leader, I would say, if you only have 3 people in your Coven, you need to not be planning events that require 8 people. Like you need to figure out, what does my 3-person Coven do? Like what are we capable of?
What can we do?
And I think there's this kind of impulse that folks have when they want to start groups to like have something functional and huge right now.
Right.
But it takes years. So with a traditional group, like if you were joining Foxfire, if you were coming to join a Gardnerian Coven, your real obligations start when you're an initiate. Like when you've been initiated, that's when gradually over time you'll be asked to be involved in maybe some parts of the ritual where you weren't before. But in Wicca as a whole, one of our other taboos, aside from proselytizing, it's so funny, everybody thinks it's like the threefold law and the Wiccan Rede, and those aren't taboos at all.
Not really.
It's right, it's actually proselytizing and asking for money. Like those are the big no-nos.
Yeah.
If you're being asked to contribute financially to a group that purports to be traditional Wiccan, like they just are not. That's like the one hard line that I will draw. Most of the time I'm like, no, everybody can use our words and it's okay, and let's be inclusive. But if somebody's charging you money to be initiated and they're calling themselves traditional Wiccan, they are not. Right. That's not to say that the whole practice, there are some traditions that do have charges associated with initiation, and I feel like that's their business and that works for them. But it's just something that we don't do in Wiccan and Wiccan groups. So if you're being asked to contribute financially, and maybe you're approaching a tradition that does have a financial obligation, it's fair to ask what the money is for. right? How
Right.
much, like, it's okay to talk about finances.
Right. Like why do you need
Right.
this? Yeah.
Yeah. And is there some other way that I could contribute? I mean, there's also a monetary value to doing things like bringing toilet paper to the
Mm.
Covenstead or
Mhm.
supplying a dish for a meal or the meal itself. Like there are
Mhm.
other ways to contribute. And it would be normal, like even at an outer court level, if we're going to have a meal before circle, I think it's perfectly appropriate to ask people like, hey, would you mind bringing a bottle of wine?
Mhm.
Like that's normal.
Yeah.
Um, but if you're being asked to run things when you just got there, that's definitely a red flag.
Yeah.
Unless you
Yeah.
signed up for that with your BFF because you're starting a coven together.
Right. And then you're like, we're doing this
Yeah.
together, but you shouldn't be expected to lead rituals or,
Yeah.
train incoming
Right.
folks, and things like that before you've kind of really fully committed yourself to
And you
that
shouldn't be
space.
ambushed. I think that's
Mm.
true in any situation.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you don't, this is something I learned in many years of therapy, right? Like, if you want somebody to meet your needs, you must first tell them what your needs are.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if
Yeah.
right, if I'm running a group, I can't just like expect my people to just, well, why didn't they do this thing that I never told them they were responsible for?
Right.
I think
Right.
that's just bad form.
Yeah. Yeah. So it should definitely be upfront. You should be aware of any responsibilities that you're going to have to take on ahead of time so that
Hmm.
you can kind of agree to them, and agree to have that level of responsibility towards the group.
Oh, totally. I
But
think
yeah.
kind of to add something else, just generally to
Mm-hmm.
our conversation, a piece that gets lost, and this is another reason why I think a lot of people get anxious about covens. I talked earlier about, people feeling like they're giving up like their individuality. The
Mm.
other thing I think people feel like they're giving up is their autonomy. Like,
Yeah.
and it's important to remember, no matter what tradition you're approaching, no matter how like old and venerable and experienced or whatever, you're still an adult. Like you are a grown up with your own autonomy and power and voice. And it is 100% okay, mandatory even, to hold on to that, which means that even if I'm like High Priestess Muckety Muck, you still get to say, hey, is there a financial cost associated with that? And what is it? This is my situation. Or
Mm-hmm.
that makes me uncomfortable. I don't want to do that. Like
Mm-hmm.
you still get to say those things.
Yeah.
Nobody takes that away from you just because they're whatever in some tradition.
Yeah, and speaking of being 18, because this could be listened to by anybody. I know back in the day, most of the advertisements that I would see for covens were very expressly, you must be
Mhm.
18 or older to join. We will not even kind of entertain it. And the only exceptions to that were the children of coven members who perhaps assisted with rituals or somehow
Mhm.
became involved in helping with coven life. Do you still see that as kind of a thing where most covens will not allow you at least full membership until you are over 18, kind of probably for
Yeah.
all those reasons, so that everyone in the room at the very least is an adult,
Yeah.
and we can assume that we're all kind of operating from a certain like base level of
Yeah.
personal responsibility.
Yeah, I've definitely still seen that where, like, I know people personally who were initiated or brought into groups when they were younger, when before they were 18.
Mm.
But in every case, they were either the child of, even oftentimes one of the group leaders,
Yeah.
or their parents were somehow like really intimately involved with the group. If like covens should never be targeting children,
Yeah.
in any capacity,
Right.
and soliciting membership to people who are legally children, I think that's one of those sort of heinous things. So it's not a blanket statement. If I had a 17-year-old,
Mm-hmm.
who was committed or had made a conscious choice, like as a parent, like we could have a conversation about consent and what does that look like when you're 17 anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Like, does that mean that they need to be a full member? Like, maybe not necessarily, but that's a conversation between child and parent. Um, my particular group and some of the other groups that I've interacted have taken it even further, and we want folks who are even older. So like I've never initiated anybody who was under 25. And it's not a hard and fast rule per se. And it's not that I think like a 23-year-old can't hack it. It's that I want people who really have a strong rooted sense of their own autonomy. I want people who feel confident pushing back on me.
Yeah.
I want people who have enough life experience to really make super informed choices. And age is not a hard and fast determinant of that. I taught high schoolers for a long time, and I know 15-year-olds with more life experience than some 30-year-olds.
Sure.
So it's not a hard and fast rule. But the tendency that I have witnessed is that there are some experiences in life as a practitioner, kind of regardless of tradition, that just tend to be more meaningful when you really are grounded in your sense of self.
Yeah.
And most young adults just aren't there yet. I certainly wasn't. Yeah, so that's something else to think about. I also want people, and I think this is true for a lot of other groups, I want people who have been off and experienced other things. I want you to be like fucking around on YouTube, you know, learning things and trying things and figuring out what you don't like or what works really well. I want you to read all of the books, including the really bad books.
Yeah.
So that you've built up that discernment. Like all of that stuff is valuable. I think we have this fear that people are going to like be steered wrong and they're going to somehow ruin themselves. And I just don't think that that's a thing. Like if you're being a thoughtful grown up and you're exploring and you're being self-reflective, like, yeah, there's so much out there. So wade through it.
Right. And speak up for yourself along the way. And I do think that it's a good practice to, I wouldn't say wait until later in life, but to just know that the decision to be in a coven, and I'm talking about covens that really practice together. It is a very grown-up decision. To bring it back to the analogy you brought up in the beginning, where it's like dating, you know, when you get to the point where you're initiating into a coven, it's like marrying someone, and there are a lot of agreements that you make with each other. Some of them may even be contractual, like you might sign agreements with folks as you become a part of a practicing house. And it's a decision to be taken seriously and to be done when you really are ready and you really are at a point in your life where you can both contribute and be there for, you know, a group of people of however large.
Yeah, absolutely.
It may be, yeah. Well, we are getting close to the end of our time, so I wanted to take a second to make sure that people know where they can find you, where they can learn more about this topic or hear you talk more about issues about Wicca, witchcraft, coven life, and things like that. So where can people find Thorn Mooney?
Not on witchbox.com anymore.
No, not anymore.
I am on basically every social media platform except for Facebook. I have kind of a placeholder page, but I really don't get to interact with people there. Find me on TikTok, where I feel very old sometimes, but it's actually really fun. And I encourage you, like if you're an elder millennial or Gen X, like I know you're being told the space isn't for you, but like it is. There's cool people there. And I'm Thorn the Witch there. You can also find me as Thorn the Witch on Instagram. And then probably the best place, if you really want to hear me be long-winded about stuff, is on YouTube. And if you search Thorn Mooney, I started my YouTube channel back in the day when like you had like random handles with numbers.
Yeah, I was wondering your YouTube. I was like, am I saying it right? Is it Drawing Canas?
Yeah, it's Drawing Canas. And it's because like I was... I had aspirations, right, as a young witch, where... Kenaz is the rune. It's sometimes called the torch, and it often is used to represent knowledge and wisdom, right? So
that's so deep.
I know. I was like hella deep.
That's so deep. I love that.
Well, drawing other. I was originally going to be like drawing answers, But then like anyway, whatever. But if it's easier to just search Thorn Mooney.
Gotcha. And we'll find you there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, definitely, folks have got to check you out. You have so much useful information, from books to videos to posts. So, folks, definitely make sure to go and find Thorn. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. This has been incredibly enlightening, incredibly informative, and I feel like I can now witch better if I am looking for Coven life. So thank you so much for all of your insight and information. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Nice hanging out.
Thank you. Thank you, witches, for tuning in to another episode of the BetterWitch podcast presented by the Modern Witch Network. New episodes air every week. You can watch the video broadcasts on YouTube every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, or listen to the audio version on your favorite podcast platform every Thursday. And if you're a BronxWitch Coven member, join us right after each YouTube broadcast for a live Q&A about the episode. So whether you're watching on YouTube or tuning in on your favorite podcast platform, we really want to hear your thoughts on today's episode. So please make sure to leave a review and drop comments wherever you are. You can show your support for this podcast by grabbing some sweet merch over on my YouTube channel. And join the BronxWitch Coven, also on YouTube, for behind-the-scene footage from today's episode and the details to join in on those live Q&As. So thanks again for tuning in. I'll see you in the next episode. Blessed be.